Well, welcome to this lovely, intimate gathering on the most frigidly cold night yet. It's lovely to see everybody here in person as well as our friends on Zoom. Hello from the comforts of your own homes. It's my pleasure to introduce myself. I'm Leslie Jones. I'm the Director of Museum Affairs and Chief Curator for the Preservation Society of Newport County. And we started this last year where not because I'm a procrastinator, but more so because I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk about things we're currently working on and focused on with our guests and our audiences. The Curator's Choice lecture goes up on our website. People sign up not knowing what they're going to get. But we are going to be speaking tonight about Raimundo di Madrazo y Curators, who was, I should say, one of the most accomplished Spanish artists both in Europe as well as in America in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but unfortunately is far overlooked in the larger discussion about great artists in that period. He somehow falls behind people like John Singer Sargent and Giovanni Boldini and Anders Zorn, but he's of the same talent and even more so, more well-known internationally than many of them. So it'll be a fun journey to take you through a bit about Madrazo, but also about two very important paintings in our collection that he depicted of the Vanderbilt women, of Alice Vanderbilt and her daughter Gertrude. The Madrid factor comes in here. We were very excited to learn about a year and a half ago that the Fundación Mapfre out of Madrid, as well as the Meadows Museum in Dallas, Texas, were putting together the first ever retrospective on Madrazo's work. And they requested the portrait of young Gertrude to be a part of that exhibition. So our conservation and collections team helped pack up Gertrude and ship her off to Madrid, where she was readily and warmly received by an incredible performance of the exhibition, and having her hung side by side with other great masterpieces by Madrazo was really, really an extraordinary feat. And likewise, this exhibition will soon be moving to Dallas, Texas. So if anybody's looking to break from the cold, in mid-February, the Meadows Museum, which is associated with Southern Methodist University in Dallas, will be hosting this exhibition as well. There will also be a catalog. I have a catalog in Spanish, which unfortunately I can't read, but there will be a catalog in English also being published and released with the debut of the exhibition in Dallas. First, to sort of get into the nuts and bolts of who Madrazo is, if you're in Spain, and particularly in Madrid, and you use the name Madrazo, you have to be very specific on which one. Raimundo di Madrazo's grandfather, Jose, on the left, was a highly accomplished painter and the former director of the Museo del Prado, which is the largest national gallery in Spain. He was also a student of Jacques-Louis David in Paris, so had one of the best training capacities in early 19th century historicism painting, which passed on to his own son and Raimundo's father, who's pictured center here, Federico de Madrazo. He became more of a historical scenery painter and had really encouraged his son to take on that same skill and genre in painting. However, unfortunately, he didn't listen to his father like most of us do. But what's great here in this juxtaposition is Raimundo on the right is depicted by his father, Federico, and Federico in the middle is depicted by his son, Raimundo. So this family of artists were incredibly close. They had portraits of each other in their own homes, as well as other great masterpieces. So a really tight-knit family that, again, in Spanish culture and in Spanish history, is revered of the highest order. Raimundo was also related to other incredibly important people within the arts and design during the period. His uncles, so his father's brothers, were Luis de Madrazo, a painter. Many of his works are at the Musée d'Orsay as well as at the Prado. Pedro de Madrazo, who was an art critic, not everybody's favorite, but certainly somebody who understood the concepts and skill level of art and published about it widely. And Juan de Madrazo, who was an accomplished architect. Ricardo de Madrazo is also a peer of his brother's Raimundo and completed several portrait paintings, but was more so focused in Spain himself. So really an incredibly accomplished family. Now, Raimundo, born to his father, was actually born in Rome because he had taken a long sabbatical from painting in Spain and traveled around Italy. So Raimundo, in some of the works that you're going to see here, and as you familiarize yourself with him, you're going to notice a lot of sort of Venetian themes, particularly a lot of masquerades and really silly parties, which is what he sort of becomes very, very well known for. As he transitioned into a more professional life as a painter, he moved to Paris and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts and became very well known in the Paris salon realm. He exhibited as well as traveled and was had patronage in Rome, London, New York, and Buenos Aires. So he was truly an international name. His work also became exported internationally from this particular painting on the right that was his first exhibition at the Paris Salon, The Masquerade. This won high honors. This was painted and exhibited in, I believe it's 1878. And it became so well known that it actually was purchased by none other than William H. Vanderbilt, who of course is the father of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Now, The Masqueraders is currently in the Lehman collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they have a really wonderful way of describing this scene in particular. So it says, a couple dressed in extravagant costume, I'll actually go back so you can see it a bit better. In extravagant costume, shared drinks in a quiet conservatory after a ball. The male leans across the table, gazing at the coquettish blonde female, whose face is hidden behind a black mask. She drapes her fingers across her chest, one of many gestures and details in the painting the Madrazo uses to evoke a playful, suggestive subject. And that particular use of femininity in his paintings is what really does separate him from a lot of his peers. Madrazo brings a sense of sensuality to his works that is in large contrast to the more academic works that and serious works that his peers are creating at the same time. So if you notice that here, you're going to see that in more of the paintings that we look towards. So again, William H. Vanderbilt purchases The Masqueraders from the Paris Salon in 1878, and it gets put into his own New York gallery at 640 Fifth Avenue. This becomes a very famous space of his collecting capabilities of mostly 19th century and contemporary artwork. And Vanderbilt's collection becomes so well known that a 2-volume catalog is published by Edward Strahan. It covers the accumulation of art that Vanderbilt has made, and which I found out through this was not one Madrazo, but actually 2. This is the Fête du Carnaval. This is also featured in Strahan's 2-volume work. And the interesting part about how Madrazo gets written up in this catalog does reflect how we also see him being written up in press publications. There's so much emphasis on the fluidity of his brushstroke and the colors that he uses. And if you have a familiarity with 19th century art at the time, this is a very vibrant scene, particularly for the 1870s, 80s, and early 90s. And you're going to start seeing pink. So just keep pink in your mind as we go through a lot of these pictures. Now, I'd mentioned that The Masqueraders is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art collection, but the Fête du Carnaval, is actually in the National Museum in Cuba, we think. That was the last recorded purchaser of the painting. And it's a rather large-scale picture. So we hope that it's still there, but I guess time will tell. And as I mentioned in the 2-volume catalog that Strahan created for the Vanderbilt collection, he again goes very far into Madrazo's practice and how he creates paintings and the process that he goes through. This gets repeated in many occasions again. The 1902 article by the Pittsburgh Index talks about this particular painting he's working on of a Mrs. Peacock from Pittsburgh. And the portraits of, it writes, the portraits of Signor de Madrazo are moving, breathing things. The eyes sparkle, the pose is always seemingly relaxing, never stiff and ungraceful. And that is entirely true. Further, Madrazo went through many different iterations of how he prepared for his paintings, including these beautiful sketches. He would first work on the face and then also create separate sketches and studies of different aspects, including the fabric and drapery in particular that you can see on the far right, and then also focusing on the way in which the drapery falls with the body and the feet. And he does a lot of full-length portraiture too. So that shows, again, not only his skill level in preparing these, but his mastery of being able to do the full body. Being a master of the face, of the hair, of the environment, of clothing and body underclothing, as well as the palette that he develops, really sets him apart from other artists. And he does not have a huge studio where he has assistants helping him. These are all his product. So again, a master worthy of being recognized. And as a part of the research for this lecture, going back to the Fête du Carnaval, I think I may have rediscovered his preparatory sketch for this painting too. And it was mislabeled in a 2023 Madrid auction catalog called The Dance. But in fact, it is, if you see here, it is the Fête du Carnaval. So, and here, this is also interesting too because it's a pen and ink preparatory sketch. So I don't know if that suggests this is something that is being captured in real life, if this is something that he's documenting with the materials that he has on hand, or if it's perhaps, he just ran out of gouache one day or pastels. Another thing that really defines Madrazo, again, is this pink that you see. And he gets it from two main sources as far as we can tell. One is from the great Spanish master El Greco. So on the left is El Greco's depiction of the Holy Family from 1585, and on the right is Madrazo's replica of it. And you can see that use of pink really becomes an important part of how he captures the audience's attention in depicting the individuals, both in model portraits, but in the portraits that are commissioned for specific individuals. Also happening at the same time is this wonderful restoration of the idea and romanticism of people like Madame de Pompadour and Marie Antoinette, and the idea of pink being this highly specified feminine color. That wasn't always the case necessarily, but the 19th century really defines it for us, and there's no going back. So pink is for girls, according to the 19th century cultural experts. It also becomes a symbol in Madrazo's portraits for trying to typify what womanhood should mean. And this is ironically in direct contrast to the suffrage movements happening in the UK and the US at the time, which translates very interestingly if you think about it. There's no record or string tying the two together, but we do know that Alice Vanderbilt wasn't necessarily for suffrage. She was among many who weren't for suffrage. So the idea of choosing Madrazo as a portrait artist, that probably was a compliment to the work that he was doing and also identifying with an artist that she felt comfortable portraying her. These are more iterations of Madrazo's work around the same time. And again, that use of pink shows up everywhere. You have Aline holding a hat on the left, the Marquise de Hervé Saint-Denis in the center. This is actually in the Madrazo exhibition. It's impossible to capture in a photograph. It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. The crystal clear of the blue and the subtlety of the pink in the skirt is just incredible. It's a reason just to go to Dallas just to see this painting. It's at the Musée d'Orsay otherwise, so maybe just go to Paris next year. And then on the right is the Rendezvous, young lady sewing while sitting on a wall. I also do love the titles of these most of these artworks that don't depict a specific individual. They're pretty literal. It's a young lady sitting on a wall sewing. But again, that pink and that, even thinking about on the right-hand side, the ideology of Marie Antoinette sort of cosplaying the farmer or the milkmaid as a part of her village at Versailles. I don't want to get too off track here, but this is a whole nother lecture we could talk about, is the 19th century European sort of, what's the word I want to use? Resuscitation of Marie Antoinette as an idol, as the martyr of France, and of Madame de Pompadour being a woman who was this great art patron, which is in total contrast to why the French Revolution happened. But the Bourbon restoration movement to bring the monarchy back used this tool, and the Americans gobbled it up because they loved the sort of the really beauty that was associated with the beauty, elegance, and richness that was associated with that last era of the French aristocracy and monarchy. But here are our portraits and questions. So now we've had a little primer on Madrazo. And on the left is the portrait of Alice Vanderbilt, and on the right is the portrait of her young daughter, Gertrude, both done in 1880. They are not the same size. Alice is substantially larger than Gertrude's, but they're done in a similar fashion and around the same time. From what we know, Gertrude was done first and then Alice afterwards, but they were both then brought back to New York and framed in the same manner. And I think what's important to talk about is why perhaps this, and this is a hypothesis I have, but why perhaps Gertrude was actually portrayed in this way. And it takes us more into the family history that I want to share with you. So at the time in 1880, when the portrait was done, Gertrude was the only surviving daughter of the family. Tragically, in 1874, Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt, then also the only daughter of the family, died at the age of 5. This portrait here on the left is in our collection. It was purchased from a member of the Vanderbilt descendants recently, and it hangs above Alice Vanderbilt's bed. This is a posthumous portrait done by J.B. Flagg, who painted many of the Vanderbilt family members, was actually related to them. And it's a very sweet and serene memory of this wonderful little girl who, unfortunately, her life ended too quickly. And on the right, we have, in 1879, the surviving siblings at the time. And you have William H. Vanderbilt II on the left, Gertrude in the center, and Cornelius Vanderbilt III on the right. And in 1880, again, Alice was 5 when she died. In 1880, Gertrude was also 5. And I can't imagine, first and foremost, from a human perspective, what losing a child would be like. And to want to make sure that this child's essence is being commemorated and that they're being captured in a way during their lifetime was probably very important to the family. And Madrazo was this up-and-coming, incredible star that made time in his studio in Paris for the family. And so what we have here is a pretty interesting composition. We have this adorable little girl, which, just to remind you, this haircut was her real haircut. So there was a bowl probably placed in her head, and she had these wonderful bangs put, which was very fashionable at the time. But she is such a complicated character in this painting. She is sweet and innocent. She is also incredibly mature. She's positioned on an incredibly fancy and ornate tabouret seat in beautiful clothes, which, by the way, this dress still exists, and it's in the family's collection, which is amazing. But the recognition of putting her on such a fancy piece of furniture is that her legs are not going to touch the ground. And so Madrazo, in order to sort of invite more innocence into this portrait, places her feet on this incredibly delicate silk pillow. And the sheen and the shine and the contrast with her boots and her matte skin is just such, there's a feeling that comes out of this. And when you think about the position that the family is in at this time, having lost their daughter, there's so much emotion and love tied up in this painting. And it's just something I want to make sure that we recognize. And likewise, the pink shows too. And knowing now that the costume exists and that pink sash still exists, we know that Madrazo isn't just making up this pink color. He is perhaps coordinating with the sitters to either purchase something that has that color, or perhaps it's just divine intervention, I'm not sure. But because it happens so frequently, I have to assume that there's some sort of pre-conversation about how these individuals are going to be depicted. Madrazo also depicts other young women and young children during this time period. It's also one of the incredible aspects of his career in that he doesn't just depict older individuals, mature adults. He depicts a lot of children, which again separates him from many of his other peers. On the left is Mercedes de Herin in 1878, so 2 years before Gertrude's portrait. And on the right is a portrait of a young girl in a pink dress from the 1890s. So we again can see the pink showing up in both of those images, one in the additional drapery of the chair and the other in the costume itself. Now these two young ladies, as well as Gertrude, again, have this sense of maturity about them, which wasn't always the case in childhood portraiture, particularly during the Gilded Age. This is a time when the idea of what childhood meant as a separate part of one's life really came into fruition. children's books became more popularized. Mass production of toys for children were readily available. The idea of childhood being something precious to preserve was really coming into its own. And we see that in material culture, but also in paintings. Oftentimes, in contrast to how Gertrude is being depicted, small children are shown through these really exquisite portraits as innocent and ethereal, and in very sort of saint-like posture. There's not a lot of distraction around them. There's not a lot of background, but more so, they are innocent souls being depicted here. Now, these are two Madrazo portraits. On the left is the portrait of Baron de Ferdinand Carlo von Strum at the age of 10, and on the right, the title is Son of the Ambassador. Now, we also see this in a portrait that's in our own collection, too, and that is of the Charles Chaplin portrait of Harold Vanderbilt. Again, this is a little boy, almost in an androgynous way, being depicted with a chemise, clutching to kittens and holding this really beautiful little basket of flowers. It's more about not the gender of the child, but more so just preserving the innocence of them, which, again, is a very Gilded Age theme. And even going back to the portrait we saw before, this photograph, there is an innocence and no clear definition about gender and roles in these paintings. It's just a child. Childhood exists solely as this incredible moment in time and being captured through these still images. And when we were looking at the portrait of Gertrude, I also want to make note of that tabaret that I had mentioned. This sort of late 18th century style furniture. This is a replica from the 19th century, but it also goes back to the idea of Marie Antoinette and the final days of the French aristocracy and monarchy. This tabaret shows up in a lot of Madrazo works, so this is probably his favorite prop. On the right is a preparatory photograph of his wife Aline at a piano, and on the left is another preparatory sketch of his wife Aline. You can see again this same tabaret is there. It shows up in this portrait that we saw before, also Aline holding a hat, and it shows up again with Gertrude. So a very prized piece of furniture that shows up in paintings and studies for at least 20 years of Madrazo's career. Now, where the portraits were destined for the family, if you can, hopefully the contrast of this shows up okay. We have one of the first images of the Gertrude painting going into the petit salon of the Vanderbilt's home in New York City. Very beautifully framed by the rest of the ornate interiors. As I had mentioned before, it comes back to the United States as just the canvas, and it's given to Thomas Wilmert, who's a very reputable and highly successful Gilded Age framer in New York City. And Wilmert creates this beautiful frame for not only this portrait, but also Alice's, again, basing it off of this era of the Marie Antoinette portraiture. This is a portrait by Vigée Lebrun of, oh no, I'm forgetting her name. It's going to come to me. Oh, shoot. It's going to come to me. This is a woman of Marie Antoinette's court, and this is a wonderful painting. I actually saw at the Nissim de Camondo in Paris in the fall. So you can see that this 18th century frame is being replicated again to sort of give that same style for this 19th century portrait of a young woman. Later, we know that the portrait of Gertrude gets moved out of the Petit Salon at 57th Street into the watercolor room to join her mother. So you can see on the left, Alice's portrait by Madrazo is hanging prominently in the center of the hall. Unfortunately, this is the only photograph I know to survive, and so that's why I've highlighted it. Gertrude's behind the pillar. We know that also the Alice portrait gets exhibited in New York around 1894 in November for the New York Academy of Art for a charity exhibition. And it's counted as part of some of the most glorious and glamorous of portraiture of New York society. And it gets written up with great acclaim. There is, however, one reaction to it in a public newspaper that suggests that Alice looks more like one of his models rather than Alice Vanderbilt. And I can assume why, though, because she's in a very relaxed position. But again, that's what makes Madrazo's work so unique and different. He's capturing this time period in a way where women and their ideas are changing, but also preserving them in this form. The Gertrude portrait gets separated from its frame probably sometime in the early to mid 20th century, and it is with Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. It is then purchased by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's niece, Sylvia Sipari, and it is put on loan in the same frame that Gertrude had placed it herself at the Breakers for many, many years and hung above her bedroom. It was then removed and reunited with the frame, and the frame had been restored. The frame had been in the attic of the Breakers in disrepair, and restoration work was taken place and conservation work on the frame, and the two were united again and were put up for sale by Herschel and Adler, a New York gallery. This is an image of the portrait at the Winter Show in New York City, which is happening right now in 2020. And I got stopped in my tracks. It was, so this is a picture I took with my phone that, I love how my iPhone circulates images of the day, and this one somehow just keeps popping up on my pictures of the day. So this was a really great moment to see the portrait. And we were able to work with Herschel and Adler to acquire the portrait and bring her back to Newport and place her above Gertrude's bed, where she has been for a few years. And that was the final installation up until recently. So we put her up, and then we took her down again when she was asked to be a part of the Madrazo show. I was able to go to Madrid in September of this year to the opening to speak with the other lenders, the other collectors of Madrazo, and really gain an entirely new appreciation for who he is, and particularly where this portrait sits in his canon. Gertrude was not placed in the exhibition with the other children. She was placed, as you can see, along a long line of mature female portraits of specific individuals, not just of models. And poetically, they also have her, and I don't have a good picture of it, but on the wall opposite of her are the two members of the Taft family, who are from Cincinnati, and Gertrude's mother, Alice, was from Cincinnati. Both portraits done by Madrazo, too. And she's at the end of the hall right before you get to the portraits of Madrazo himself. And so I was able to capture this image, and also this woman who obviously loves Gertrude. And I couldn't agree with her more. The way the curator described this portrait was, it's hard to, I wish I had written it down, but it exists in Madrazo's oeuvre, his surviving paintings, as one of the most significant, not only in the way that it's a full-length portrait of a child, it's of a Vanderbilt, but also just the way in which he executes care in depicting her face. It is so much of a likeness of her. There's no Madrazo touch to her face. He doesn't typify anyone's facial expressions for himself and to define himself. He uses color to do that, but he renders her so perfectly as she was that it's really an admired painting throughout his work. And I'm going to close just with a reminder that these are the two institutions that we were very happy to partner with in bringing this exhibition together. The Madrid show closed at the end of the year, and again, the Meadows Museum show will begin in about 3 weeks. So I urge you to look at their website and to plan a trip to Dallas if you can, after the winter storms have passed. And I'm happy to take any questions.
I always have to ask you a question.
Oh, is it on?
Hello?
Yes.
There I am. So I always have to ask a question.
Yes.
I was curious, you said that he was very true to how Gertrude really looked as a child, but Alice really was kind of a homely woman, actually, in a lot of her pictures, and he's made her look quite glamorous. I suppose that's part of what you do as a society portraitist.
Well, and also probably how one dresses up for a portrait as well. Particularly
but I mean, her face is very, it's sort of flattering.
Well, and you have to wonder if that's why he brings pink into his portraits, if it's to help enhance skin tones of various tones. She certainly, in many of her portraits, is more depicted in a plainer sense. But in terms of, the way we've seen her with her very small grin, as well as, the depth of her brows, it's incredibly true to her likeness. And I say that because if you think about people like Gilbert Stuart, or if you think about, Gilbert Stuart in particular, with his egg-shaped head that he gives almost all of his subjects, or even John Singer Sargent, there's a way in which he depicts people that gives us a Sargent tone to the shape of their face. Madrazo renders people as identical copies of the likenesses that we see through photography, which, again, separates him from many of his other contemporaries who are looking for ways to showcase what their style is, but at the sake of depicting the viewer. Oh, come on, you've got to have more questions. I will say, too, that Gertrude comes back to us in June.
So how prolific was he? Like, what was the body of his work? Like, we have hundreds of portraits, thousands? Or?
Yes, I would, from my understanding and from the work actually that the Meadows Museum has done, from a preliminary sketch perspective, there are thousands, like over 7,000 known drawings. And then from his actual portraits, he completed hundreds, near 1,000. Like I had said, for about 10 years, he came to New York for about 10 weeks. And until he died in actually it was more than 10 years. So it was about 1897 to 1920, so over 20 years. He would come to New York for about 10 weeks to paint portraits of women of society. And they would come in from places like Pittsburgh and Chicago and Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. And sometimes they would bring the press with them. And that's how the Pittsburgh Index records Madrazo's process, because they're sitting in the studio with him painting Mrs. Peacock. So he was sought after on a variety of levels, not just by the people who wanted to sit for him, but also for the people that wanted to document him.
I guess the other question would be, how long would it take per portrait for him to do something like that?
It's a good question. It doesn't sound like it was something that happened within those 10 weeks. I think that it sounds like the canvases may have traveled with him because of all those preparatory sketches. So the visit to the studio would probably be that sort of initial capturing of the person, of the pose, of the mannerisms, and then it sounds like he would be working on them for much longer than that. If he transported them back to Europe with him is unclear, or if he left them for when he returned, but you certainly had to wait a good deal of time to have these portraits delivered. Yeah. Oh. You got to take the microphone, Patty.
You said, I speak so loudly anyway. You said mostly of societal women, but I'm asking, does he depict men independently other than other artists in his own family?
Yes, he does depict many men of society. In fact, I'm trying to think of the man's name. A very close family friend of the Vanderbilts, whose name I'm forgetting his name. But most of his male portraits are not full length. They're almost all half length, which I think is interesting too. And it's also sort of what people expect at that time period. But did not depict any of the members of the Vanderbilt family, as far as we know. From the other women that he depicted, though, since it's on my mind, he did depict Gertrude Vanderbilt again in the mid 1890s. We don't know where that portrait exists, but it is documented in an account book that the Meadows Museum has. We don't believe that Gertrude liked it very much, so that's probably why we don't see it. He also painted Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, as well as Caroline Astor. So again, it's compounded in terms of all these incredibly significant women that he portrayed. I can't find them. So maybe in private collections. Who knows?
You mentioned the first beautiful painting of that great party is supposedly in Cuba. Why is it supposed? I mean, when was the last time anybody happened to see it in Cuba, and why don't we know a little more about it?
I don't think it's been seen since the 1980s. So I'm not entirely sure if it's still in the museum, if it's used for other purposes in Cuba, but much of the artwork that ends up going to those museums isn't as widely available or able to be tracked down as other countries or other institutions. So we hope it's still there. And I don't know how it got from William H. Vanderbilt to Cuba. That'll be another rabbit hole to go down. Yes.
I was just wondering, does an artist have much say in the frames that go with these of their artwork? Because you had the two different frames for that picture, and they obviously portrayed a different view of the picture for me, or the artwork, I should say. Once it got its original one back, it was much more entertaining to look at.
Oh, absolutely. No, it feels like it fits very well. So we know that, again, the framer is a New York-based framer. And so the painting, having been finished in Paris, had to be transported back to the US. And then it's possible that there was the idea of this being replicated because, again, as I had shown here, these frames were widely seen in Paris. So most all of the frames that you're going to see of this period of the mid to late 1880s before the Revolution, women, particularly depicted by Vigée Lebrun, are going to be in this style frame. So they probably knew that already, and in the sort of various elements that are mimicking or showing adoration for this style of portraiture, I'm sure it was rather decided on what they were going to be creating. Now, in terms of our plywood masterpiece here, I think this was more of a necessity because the other frame had fallen into disrepair, which is entirely reasonable. I wish I had a closer image, but the plaster work around the wreath has a wire that goes through it. That plaster is incredibly fragile. And depending on the environment that it's exposed to, it will just crumble. So the masterful work that was done to restore this, I'm not sure by whom, but it was done very, very well. Yes.
Question, was this a statement by the family with the other portraits of children were angelic and them really this formal portrait in 1880? Was it a big reveal? Were they trying to bring grandiose things or just make a compelling message, do you think? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not that we can document, in looking through digitized newspapers and articles that are available, there's nothing that suggests that this was revealed as some sort of debut when it returns to the home. But I mean, my impression of these two pieces, particularly knowing that she was at first destined for this petit salon, it's much more of an intimate, heartfelt gesture in terms of her being executed in this way. And knowing also that the portrait that was done by J.B. Flagg posthumously of young Alice was only her face and not the rest of her body because she was no longer with us, perhaps recording and detailing all of Gertrude was even more meaningful in that way.
This is slightly off topic, but we've been looking at several grand people beside you on the walls. Can you tell us who's in this room?
Oh, God. Not off the top of my head. I don't think I'm in the mindset to do that. We don't have labels. Yes, that's her son. Yes, Nathaniel Hill and Mrs. Crawford Hill, and. Mm-hmm. Mrs. Havermeyer, yes, Mrs. Havermeyer here. Do you want to come up here, Ray? Come on. This is why you're a master guide. So, but so these portraits are not of women from Newport. These have been incredibly generous gifts to the Preservation Society over the years, and this is the room that they fit in. But they are from a variety of different artists, and they do. I mean, it's not slightly off topic. It is on topic. How people choose to be portrayed, and a lot of that is who they see themselves as, but also the artists that they choose to do that, because each of these artists has such a specific style. So from Madrazo's perspective, people, I think if you liked pink, you knew that you were going to have that as a part of your composition, but also the way in which he uses color, again, really makes him stand out. I'm sorry if I failed. 11 houses, 100,000 objects. It's too much to keep track of. Yes. Yes. So the question for those on Zoom is, was there anything about the process of selecting Madrazo as the artist? Not that we're aware of. But obviously, being familiar with him, with William H. Vanderbilt having already collected his artwork, there was probably some sort of family connection. I would assume if William H. Vanderbilt is purchasing works from the Paris Salon, he must have been in Paris, and then thus also met the artist and made that connection. So the likelihood is that it was an introduction via the family. Yes.
I kind of jumbled up a point you were trying to make. I'm hoping you can go back.
Okay.
I think you were talking about the use of pink, but then suffragette movement?
Yes.
Well, could you just do that again?
So the ways in which Madrazo, let's see if I can find a good slide to land on. This one's a good one. The way in which Madrazo depicts women is very empowering, but he also reverts back to this historically referential style in depicting ladies. I mean, these are, in some cases, 19th century dress, but they're also very much looking back to 18th century styles and the ways in which, let's see if I can articulate this in a better way. The suffrage movement in the US starts around 1860, and it progresses and moves through society, and women of great wealth start to adapt onto it, like Alva Belmont. But there's also the other side of the story where there are women who didn't want suffrage. They weren't interested in getting the right to vote. Life was just fine how it was. And so we see, in particular, portraiture that is historically referential, sort of leaning towards that more conservative approach to women's rights. And while I said I can't make a direct connection to it, but Madrazo's work were for incredibly wealthy women, most of whom documented were against suffrage, including Alice. So I'm not saying that that's why she chose him, but I'm sure it was certainly an added bonus in terms of his particular vehicle of showcasing women in traditional ways rather than in more progressive ways.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Liz.
Thank you.